Our second lecture in our new section on sports and the culture and biology around athletics. So today's lecture, we're going to start with some of the bits that we didn't finish from last week. And then we'll have an awesome guest lecture by a professor in the classics department, Dr. Robert Steffen, about ancient athletics and the role of sport as spectacle in the ancient world. So that will be the bulk of our class today.
All right, good afternoon, students. I hope you are doing well. I'm the guest lecturer for today, Dr. Robert Steffen. Let me go ahead. I'm gonna pin myself here. The way we're gonna do this is similar to what Dr. Montgomery was doing, where I'm gonna project the slides behind me here. So let's go ahead and see if we can blow this thing up. All right, there we go. All right, looking good. Let's get to it. Welcome, class, to today's guest lecture on ancient athletics. And what we're today is we're going to start by thinking about what sport actually is. I don't know how much you guys have discussed this so far, but we are going to try to actually define this term. And what we're going to find is that it's a little bit more difficult than we might expect. Then we are going to start thinking about where and when sport actually started, right? Kind of building off our definitions. When do we actually get the beginning of what we would consider sport? And we'll throw a couple options out there. And then finally, what we'll do to conclude today is we'll look at the ancient Olympics, see how they started, and then look at kind of not only what went on, but how they're tied into the rest of society, right? So think about how the ancient Olympics tie into religion and politics and economics and culture and warfare, all these things, right? And what we're going to find is that sport in the ancient world, especially in the ancient Greek world, is intimately tied to all other aspects of culture. Okay, so here's what I want you guys to do. Let's go ahead and tackle these questions. I'm going to go ahead and put you guys in breakout rooms here. You've got 5 minutes, all right, to come up with answers to these 3 questions. All right, I want to know in your own definition, what is sport? How do you define it? Okay, and one way to think about that is to think about how it compares and contrasts with similar terms, right? So how is like a sport different from athletics? Or is it the exact same thing? Or how is a sport different from a game? Or how's sport different from play? How are they similar? That sort of thing, all right? So that's part 1. Part 2, I want you guys to try to explain to me, why are people doing this, right? Especially in the ancient world. This is bonkers here, right? Shouldn't they be out like hunting or farming or like, I don't know, working a job or something like that? Why are people competing in sports at all? Okay, so those are your questions right now. Let me go ahead. I've actually never used breakout rooms before. Let's go ahead and, looks like you guys are already in rooms. There we go. Okay, so you've got 5 minutes and then we'll be back. All right. So I want to go take some answers from the audience here. I'm not giving you a correct answer, right? A perfectly right answer in terms of what a sport actually is, but I want to hear from you guys. How did you define this? Maximus, you are up first. I see your hand raised. Go ahead, feel free to unmute yourself and let me know what your group came up with in terms of what a sport actually is.
For me, I said the definition was just an athletic activity that can be like official in some manner, and it's also normally some form of a competition, like there's normally winners and losers involved.
Okay, so your main kind of components would be athletic in nature, some sort of formal organization, and a competitive atmosphere.
Yeah, that's kind
okay,
of the
great,
main
great.
things I said.
Excellent. Yeah, feel free to keep going.
And then for the differences between the terms, I was just saying, like, in my opinion, you can be like an athlete or be into athletics without being involved in like sports, because like, I don't know, I feel like it's the same, or is like a person's still an athlete in between like seasons of a sport. Like they don't just stop being an athlete just because they stop like competing. Um, and then I said games are kind of more general. Like a sport could be a game, but it also doesn't have to be. Like I don't think many people would say like running events are really like games, but they're still sports. Um, and then for play, I just said like that's also kind of general. Like you can, it's it kind of encompasses more than just sports. Um, so I think that's
Okay,
what I
so
like.
you could be playing but not doing a sport. But if you're doing a sport, then you are playing. Is that kind of
Yeah,
the way that
it's
relationship
like
would work?
the rectangle, or all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares, kind of deal.
Exactly. Great. Well, thank you so much, Maximus. Nissa, I'd like you to jump in. Feel free to tackle a little bit of the definition, and I'd love to hear what you're thinking about in terms of kind of why groups actually engage in sport when it doesn't have the same sort of functionality as maybe some other things in terms of working, agriculture, that sort of thing.
Thank you. When we were talking, we were discussing like when we were mentioning like why it's different from games or play. I brought up it's like board games. Board games aren't a sport because you're not on a team with any other person typically, and it's not as competitive like Maximus was saying. While in most sports that we know of today, there's multiple people on a team playing against another, and there's a common goal among the players to either score goals, get touchdowns, that kind of thing. And when we were discussing like why in ancient athletics they would engage in sports, we thought it was mainly due to the lack of moral support, which is why they would play and would conduct these sports. Because not only is it important to grow food and go hunt for resources, it's also important to have a moral balance and like just overall good spirit in oneself, I would assume. So
a little of what you're saying is that it kind of builds like a sense of ethics or morality or something like that. Engaging in sport is conducive to kind of who we are as people and how we act.
Yeah, and in most sports you have a team captain or a quarterback. It's very necessary to have a quarterback in the real world, whereas you need a leader to tell you what to do, and you need a leader as to like to guide you what to do, and it just builds up that team functionality, and without it I feel like we wouldn't be where we are today.
Wonderful. Well, thank you guys so much, Maxima and Nissa. I really appreciate your participation there. Here's what we're going to do for the next 24 minutes. All right. We are going to go on a like wildly fast ride through the history of ancient athletics. All right. In terms of note taking, I just wanted to kind of give you a bit of sense for what the takeaways are going to be. Okay. Don't worry about writing down everything, every word on every slide. All right. That level of kind of specificity isn't really necessary here. What I would like you to do is when we get to kind of the end of each section and we talk a little bit about what the takeaway points are of that section, right? Really hone in on those, right? Try to grasp what the major takeaway points are. And if you can come up with one or two pieces of evidence to support those points, then you've got plenty of notes. All right. So we're going to go quite fast. Don't feel like you're overwhelmed because you can't get every word down, but do really dial in on those takeaway points. All right. So let's go ahead and get back to our slideshow over here. We are going to first begin here with trying to figure out what the earliest sport actually is. And in order to do that, we have got to go to kind of the Near Eastern world sometime around 5,000 years ago. And this is the period that we call the Bronze Age, right? Because we're not very creative as historians and archaeologists, and that's when they invented bronze. But here's where we are, right? So this is modern day Turkey, ancient Anatolia, the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates, and then the Nile River Valley, right, in modern day Egypt. And this is where we start to get evidence for some of the earliest things that we would normally, or maybe potentially, consider sports. So let's first kind of dive into this area of Mesopotamia, the Greek word for the middle of the two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, and see what sort of evidence we have. So here's piece of evidence number one, all right? What we're looking at is a relief stela dating to about 4,000 years ago, about 2000 BCE. And what we appear to be looking at over here, right, are two people engaged in boxing. Now, here's what I want to know. I want you guys to blow me up in the chat here and tell me, how in the world do we know that they're like, this is like potentially a sport or boxing or something like that, and it's not like two people trying to kill each other? Like, there are no words attached to this. We have no written text. The image itself is all we have. How do we know this is potentially a sport? Okay, so gloves, very good. Similar stances. They're facing each other. They don't seem that aggressive, right? For some reason. What's some of the things that you might expect if they actually were engaged in warfare? No weapons, that's good. No armor, no weapons, right? Those are all things that you might expect if you were actually depicting some sort of warfare, which you absolutely get in the ancient world, right? But here, the two people are dressed exactly the same, right? Like you mentioned, there seemed to be some sort of kind of gloves or some sort of wrapping around the wrist, right? There's no armor. They're just wearing these kind of skirts here. And so these are the things that make archaeologists think that we're looking at some sort of combat that's not intended to kill the other person, all right? Now, one of the things I want you to think of for yourself is, would this, right, match your criteria in terms of being an actual sport? So let's go ahead and look at some of the other options that we got from very early on. So this is from a tomb in Egypt, dating to right around the same time. So it's actually known as the Tomb of Bakhti. We have the guy's actual name. It's about 4,000 years ago, again, 2000 BC. It's in Middle Egypt, a site called Beni Hassan, which is known for its really elaborate tomb paintings of daily life, which is kind of cool, right? It's not just the royal pharaonic tomb paintings. These are daily life scenes. And here, what you're looking at, right, is again, something sort of similar where we're getting a bunch of different images of people seemingly engaged in some sort of kind of combat sports, right? Kind of boxing or wrestling or something along those lines. It appears to be quite a few different scenes of that nature. So we're getting that from Mesopotamia. We're getting that from Egypt, all around 2000 BC. So we get those early combat sport-like things, right? In a different realm, we also get hunting from a very, very early age. Right? And so when we look back at ancient Mesopotamia, we see especially in Babylonian and Assyrian art, the depiction of the king hunting wild beasts is a really, really popular motif. So here we can see the king, the Assyrian king here, defeating a lion, right? Now, one of the things to keep in mind here is our best evidence. We have a few texts that describe some of this as well. And one of the things that ends up happening is that these evolve over time from wild beast hunts to like kings eventually start putting up fences. And then instead of just them going out hunting, it's them plus, like you can see here, right, all their attendants, just in case the lion gets any funny ideas of actually trying to attack the king. And so again, this is, you could consider hunting a sport. Depending on your definition, it might fall in there, it might not. We get very, very similar imagery, although in a non-pharaonic context from Egypt again. So here we're in the New Kingdom, and what we're looking at, right, is a tomb painting of the deceased here, going through some of the things he would have done during his daily life, right? So hunting birds in the marshlands. So far in terms of these very early sports, what we've got, right, we've got combat sports, We've got hunting, which is maybe kind of sort of a little bit of a sport. And then our third thing to look at are these kind of ritual performances of power. All right. And so what we're looking at here is an inscription that is describing the Sumerian king of Ur, a guy by the name of Shulgi, which right again dates to around 2000 BCE. And if we look at the inscription, we look at what it says, he seems to be engaged in some sort of kind of sport-like event, right? So the inscription goes, right? So that my name should be established for distant days and never fall into oblivion, that it leave not the mouth of men, that my praise be spread throughout the land, that I may be eulogized in all the lands. I, the runner, rose in my strength, all set for the course from Nippur to Ur. I resolved to traverse it, as it were but a distance of 1 double hour. Like a lion that wearies not of its virility I arose, put a girdle about my loins, swung my arms like a dove feverishly fleeing a snake, spread wise the knees like an Anzu bird with eyes lifted toward the mountain. Now, he's bragging, right, about making this epic run from Nippur to Ur in like but a double hour. Now, this is utterly impossible, by the way. I looked up the Google Maps thing to see how long it takes to get from Nippur to Ur, and it's like 120 miles. So he probably didn't do that in like 2 hours, but he's bragging about this kind of performative athletic event, right? His ability to do it successfully, and in doing so, to highlight the strength and speed of him as the ruler of his people. And we get something similar with something known as the Hebsed festival in ancient Egypt, okay? So the Hebsed festival is an Egyptian ritual of kingship. So one of the things that happens in ancient Egypt is that kings can live, they tend to live sometimes for a very, very long time, all right? And one of the problems that arises with this is that you could eventually end up in a scenario where you got a king who's like 80 years old. He's all frail and old, can't do anything. And like, you know, he's not a very strong leader for his people. Now, some people even argue that in the earliest days of Egypt, there would have been some sort of like ritual sacrifice of the king, right? At a certain age, after 30 years, the king is eliminated and a new king goes in to take his place. But what eventually evolves, if that ever occurred, eventually we get a festival that instead of the king dying or abdicating the throne, he goes through a ritual performance to demonstrate his continued strength, okay? And that's known as the Hebsed festival. And in doing that, what the king does is he has to run twice around the palatial complex. So the palace is fairly large. He's got to do 2 kind of wind sprints around this thing. And if he makes it around that, his power is restored for another 3 or 4 years. If he doesn't make it, I don't know if he like trips or falls, or he's just like very tired and doesn't want to do it, then he actually is killed. So, you know, talk about your all-time great incentives for doing well in an athletic event. So this is the kind of third version of what we get in the earliest stage in the Bronze Age, in terms of types of athletic sort of things that are maybe kind of sort of sports, right? On the one hand, we definitely have an athletic performance. There are rules to how this has to occur. On the other hand, it's not like Shulgi, right? It's not like our guy Shulgi or the Egyptian pharaohs. They're not racing anybody else, right? It's not like when we're looking at the hunts of the like Assyrian kings that they're like seeing who can hunt the most lions. It's just the king doing his thing, right? And so in some ways, right, again, it's an athletic performance. In other ways, it doesn't have necessarily the same competitive nature that we might associate with sport in the modern world. Now, let's go ahead, right? We've spent most of our time somewhere around 4,000-ish years ago, 4,000, 3,000 years ago in Mesopotamia and in ancient Egypt. And what we're going to do now is we're going to take a little swim across the Mediterranean to the Greek world, right? So this is the Aegean over here. It gets started pretty late in the Bronze Age, but once it gets going, we get some pretty cool things. And in particular, we're going to now go to the island of Crete right here. So here we are on Crete at the site of Knossos, which is the largest palace on the island, and it's associated with the Minoan culture. And what we end up getting here is similar sorts of iconography to what we see in the Near East, just happening a little bit later. So we get boxing frescoes from the island of Thera from the Minoan culture. Again, same things that you guys mentioned earlier, right? They're dressed the same. There's no armor. They're wearing gloves. They seem to be, engaged in some sort of competitive thing, but not trying to necessarily kill each other. So we get boxing. This is known as the boxer raiton. A raiton is an ancient Greek like pouring vessel here. And once again, you can see people competing down here, right, in some sort of like kind of combat sport, ritual combat sport against each other. And we can see that on, it's a little easier to see actually on the drawing, like when you look over here, right, you can see them doing that up in the upper register there. But what I want you guys to do now is look a little bit at the lower register here, right? Like what's going on like right in like over here, right? We get these dudes who appear to be like majestically leaping over the backs of bulls. And it turns out that when you look at it in Minoan Crete, this imagery is everywhere. So this is one of the frescoes. And here again, we can see some acrobatic performer leaping over the back of a charging bull. And then we appear to have two attendants or priests or something like that kind of guiding the performance on the side. This is one of the most famous frescoes from the site, but we also get this imagery elsewhere, right? Little bronze statuettes with somebody leaping over a bull, a golden seal over here, right? That you would use to put into wax or ceramics to make your imprint with somebody leaping over a bull. So again, when we look at the takeaways here, right? The existence of sport during this period of time, this earliest stage of sport, whether you consider it sport or not really depends on kind of how you define that term, right? We seem to get kind of non-lethal combat competition, right? Boxing, wrestling, that appears fairly early. And then we also get a lot of displays of power and strength, right? So Shulgi's inscription about his run from Nippur to Ur, the Egyptian Hebsed festival, all examples of the king performing his strength for his people. So what I'd like to do now is shift our gaze from the Bronze Age, where we get this kind of pseudo sport, and move to the Olympics, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to start with the modern Olympics, and then we're going to work our way backwards all the way to the beginning of the ancient Olympics, all right? So we have our Olympics today. We have the beautiful rings, right, going on every kind of Summer Olympics every 4 years, Winter Olympics every other 4 years. And this was the idea of this nice little chap over here, a guy by the name of Pierre de Coubertin, who founded the modern Olympics in 1896. And you can see, this is kind of cool, one of the original like posters from the original, like the new modern Olympic Games starting in Athens in 1896. Now, Pierre de Coubertin gets all the credit for this, all right, for restarting the Olympics. But I want to make the argument that like, this did not come out of nowhere, right? This is not a continuous thing from the ancient world, but he was building on things that were already happening, all right? So at that original Olympics in 1896, we get 14 nations coming together, 241 athletes, and there were 43 different events taking place right here with this good-looking chap on the top of the podium in the Pentathlon Stadium in Athens, all right? And so this is happening in 1896, but it's building on things that came before it. So about 30 years prior to that, we get John Hulley, who institutes the Grand Olympic Festival in Liverpool. It only happens twice, 1862 and 1866, but he's already got something called the Olympics. It takes place in Britain, and it never really catches on. But Hulley wasn't the first person either. Prior to that, a few years earlier, we get the Wenlock Olympian Society, right? And so this is another group of British people. They decide we should have the Olympic Games again and restart those. And so they kind of sort of start that. Those actually still are going on today. which is kind of weird. But they're not the first ones either. We look back another 30 years in Sweden. They have something, I don't know have any idea how to pronounce Swedish, but the Olympiska Spelen I Rimlusa in 1834. So they've got something called the Olympic Games. We go back even further into like revolutionary period France. They've got the Olympiade de la République in 1796. And we go back even further. We're back into the 1600s now with the Cotswold Olympic Games, the first kind of modern version where we get the term Olympics. And these were put on for a few years. This is kind of cool, an old manuscript from these things. And so I guess people like, I don't know, fought each other with swords or something like that. But anyway, that's a brief history of kind of the modern Olympics and where it came from. Again, our most recent iteration starts again in 1896, but it's building on different people who were playing with this idea of restarting the Olympics. Now, when we look at the similarities and differences, what we're going to see is that it's got some similarities, right? Some of the events are the same, but it's got quite a few differences, right? This like torch procession here from Olympia to wherever it takes place, that didn't happen in antiquity. Medals over there, that didn't happen in antiquity. These rings up here, that didn't happen in antiquity. These are all modern inventions, and you can see some of the major differences, right? Women weren't participating in the ancient Olympics. No water sports in the ancient Olympics. No winter sports in the ancient Olympics. No ball sports in the ancient Olympics. But we do get some similarities, right? This kind of multi-year cycle, the oath, the peaceful assembly, that sort of thing. Okay, so that's a little bit on the modern Olympics. Let's go to Olympia, though, and see what is going on in terms of the origin of the ancient Olympics and how those actually run. So we're looking at Greece here. Athens is on the Attica Peninsula. Olympia here is in the western part of the Peloponnese. And when we look at the site, this is an archaeological plan of the site, the first thing you notice in this region right here is that it's filled with temples. All right, these are all religious structures. The Temple of Hera, the Temple of Zeus, the Pelopion, right? That's named after this guy Pelops that we'll hear about in a second, an altar to Zeus, the Hippodamion. All of these are religious structures, and the ancient Olympic Games is intimately tied with religion in ancient Greece. You can't separate them out, right? The games are a celebration of religion. The religion is tied to the games. Now, there are two origin stories in ancient Greece for how these get going. One is the story of Pelops. Now, Pelops, his life starts out pretty rough, right? He's the son of a guy named Tantalus who ended up chopped up his own son, Pelops, and fed him to the gods as a way to test the omniscience of the gods. And most of the gods were like, no, obviously you chopped up your son and tried to feed him to us. Except for Demeter. Demeter was in this thing because Persephone was gone. And so Demeter's just eating away and eats a piece of his shoulder. But either way, right, after the gods figure this out, right, they put poor Pelops back together and Hephaestus builds him a new shoulder. And Pelops eventually makes his way into Greece, where he finds the beautiful Hippodamia, the daughter of King Oenomaus. Now, King Oenomaus will only give away his daughter to somebody who can beat him in a chariot race. And nobody ever has, because he has these like magical horses. And so Pelops ends up praying to the god Poseidon. And Poseidon tells him to go to the kind of right-hand man of Oenomaus, the kind of stable master. And he gets that guy to replace the axles in the chariot, move them from wood or bronze, and replace them with wax. And so what ends up happening when the race starts and those wheels start spinning and they start heating up, the wax starts to melt. And Oenomaus has the wheels fall off and he crashes to his death on the chariot course. And then in honor of that, in honor of King Oenomaus, in order to purify what has just happened, Pelops institutes the first Olympic Games as kind of a celebration and to purify that event. So that's origin story number one. Origin story number two has to deal with our main man Heracles over here. And one of his labors is shoveling a bunch of shit out of these stables from these magical horses that just crap all day long and it's super poisonous. And eventually he diverts a river and sends the river through the stables and that's what clears it out. And then it was near that event, right, near that river, that he institutes these Olympic Games in order to honor Zeus, his father as a celebration of his dad and being able to complete this labor. And so, right, here's Heracles lifting up the rock and letting the waters flow through. So again, we can see all of ancient Olympia dedicated very, very heavily to the gods. And we can take a look at the actual remains, right? So this is the Temple of Zeus at Olympia today. You can see a recreation of what that looks like. And inside is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the chryselephantine, the golden ivory statue of Zeus, right? One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Now, in terms of actual history, we think the games actually started sometime in the early 8th century BCE, with the traditional founding date being 776. And we have these victor lists. This is a papyrus of all the Olympic victors through time, and we go work backwards to get to that 776 date. The first guy who won is this guy, Coroebus of Elis. So let's go ahead and we're just going to take a very, very quick jaunt through what those games are, and we'll finish up. You might have to stick around an extra 2 minutes, but give me 5 minutes and we'll be done here, all right? So the games themselves are a series of different officials who come together to put these things on. And what we end up seeing is that we do get some of these events, right? There's kind of a sacred truce amongst all the city-states who compete. There's an oath that the athletes swear, and then the judges control the events themselves. And this is super important, right? This is one of the main takeaways. Ancient Greece is incredibly diverse, right? We've got the kind of Greek mainland here, but all these areas in green are Greek city-states, and they're all politically independent. And so one of the reasons the Olympic Games is so important in ancient Greece is that it brings together city-states that compete with each other to compete in a peaceful way, right? Rather than on the battlefield killing each other, it brings them together in a productive way to compete. And it builds these bonds that then lets them compete against outsiders like the Persian Empire later on because they built those cultural bonds. So here we are at Olympia. This is the stadium, or the ancient Greek stadion. That's where all the events outside of the chariot and horse races took place. So everything, right? The pentathlon, the foot races, all of it takes place here. You can see there are no seats. People just sit on the grassy banks, and the only area you get the seating is for the judges right over here on the side. So we've got a series of different foot races, right? The very first Olympics was just a single event, just this sprint right here. And then over time, it starts to add all these other ones, like the Hoplitodromos, a long race in full armor. And so there you can start to see how this starts to tie in with militaristic events and kind of military training as well. The javelin will also be conducive to military training. And that's part of what we call the pentathlon, these 5 events: the javelin, the discus, the broad jump, and then the races and wrestling. And wrestling is the first of the combat sports, right? So we've got Greco-Roman wrestling, right? So wrestling like this, we've got boxing, and then we've also got the pankration. And this is, you can think of as like ancient MMA. The only 2 rules in the pankration: no biting, no eye gouging. Anything else totally goes. You've got horse races, right? You've got a 4-horse chariot race, a 2-horse chariot race. You've got an actual horse race where you're riding a horse. So again, these are things that would have been used on the battlefield as well. And then the winners of the Olympic Games would have been given an olive wreath crown. So just to kind of conclude here, a couple of the ways that this is tied into society. First and foremost, right, this is a huge part of staying physically fit, right? Participating in a sport is just something that keeps you actually healthy. It also gives you a productive, socially acceptable way to compete with one another, right? To kind of strive for excellence that's usually found on the battlefield, but do so in a non-life-threatening sort of way. It gives you a way to be productive when you are on the battlefield, right? Like if you look through those events, like half of them are training for different militaristic things. It gives you a way to honor the gods, especially the Olympics. It is so tied to the worship of Zeus, Hera, other gods at the site of Olympia. And then finally, right, and perhaps most importantly, Greece is a series of city-states that are all operating independently when it comes to politics, right? They share a culture, they share a religion, they share a language, but politically they're independent. The Olympic Games give them an opportunity to come together productively, to build those cultural relationships, and to compete with each other, again, in a productive, non-life-threatening way, and then build bonds that allows them to team up when they get threats from the outside, like we'll see with the Persian Empire. So if this is your kind of deal, check out Ancient Athletics. I'm teaching it this summer. It's Classics 240. It should be a blast, and we'll go into a lot more detail on what those events are, how they operate, and how they tie in to ancient Greek society. The second half of that course is all based on the gladiatorial games, which are just a wild, wild ride. We did get the artifact of the day. That was Timbuktu. So go ahead and put that in while you still got a chance. But thank you all for sticking with me today. Sorry to keep you a few extra minutes. And I hope to see you in one of my classes in the near future.
Thanks,
All right.
Dr. Stefan, for the guest lecture. And we'll see everybody on Thursday, where we continue our walk back in time to talk about the evolution of running.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
you.
See you later.
Have a good one.
Thank you.